Pokrovskoye, 1869. This was not a place, this was a punishment. A forgotten village on the banks of the Tura River, where winters were long as a curse and summers short enough for flies to breed. There was nothing here but barren land, silent people, and a vague fear of God and the spirits that lurked in the woods. Into this rough world, Grigory Rasputin was born, not a child of love, but a product of survival. His father, Yefim, was a drunken peasant, a rough cabman with hands as big as 2 shovels. His mother, Anna, was a woman exhausted by childbirth and loss. They had 8 children, but cold, disease, and the harshness of Siberia claimed 7 of them. Only Grigory survived, a tenacious weed rising from the ashes. Rasputin's childhood was a cesspool of ignorance, violence, and superstition. He grew up like a wild animal, unable to read or write. His schools were sour-smelling taverns, muddy fields, and bloody brawls. He learned about the world not through books, but through fists, through the eyes of horses he stole, through the moans of village girls he dragged into haystacks. He was tall, sinewy, with a bushy beard and eyes. Oh, those eyes. They were blue-gray, deep and penetrating. They didn't look at you. They stripped you bare, saw through your dirtiest secrets, your most sinful desires. The villagers both feared and were drawn to them, calling him Rasputin, which means the rake, a name he bore like a badge. At 17, he seduced a peasant girl named Praskovya Dubrovina. They married. He became a husband and a father. He plowed, drank, beat his wife, and the cycle of Siberian peasant life seemed to close in on him. But inside that rough man, a hunger for power and meaning stirred. At 28, something broke. Perhaps it was a long drunken stupor, a delirium tremens, or simply the awakening of a monstrous ambition. He realized that the prison of peasant life was too small. He needed a bigger stage, and the only stage available to an illiterate man in Russia at that time was religion. He threw it all away, his wife, his infant son, his unborn child. He announced that he was going on a pilgrimage, an act of a selfish fugitive fleeing his own mediocrity. His journey was a metamorphosis. He walked thousands of miles, lived on alms, slept in stables, his body smelling sour of sweat and dirt. He came to the monastery of St. Nicholas not to seek salvation, but to seek the secrets of spiritual power. He learned to read and write clumsily, but more importantly, he learned to act. He acquired the voice of a prophet, the bearing of an ascetic, and the look of authority. When Rasputin returned to Pokrovskoye, he was a changed creature. He did not drink wine or eat meat. He wore coarse robes, his hair and beard were tangled, his fingernails were black with dirt, but his eyes glowed with a terrifying brilliance. He spoke of God in a deep, monotonous, strangely hypnotic voice. His magic began to work, first of all on women. They, trapped in a life of labor and obedience, saw in Rasputin a way out. He held secret prayer meetings in his father's damp cellar, which smelled of rotten potatoes. Rumors began to spread, dark and erotic. It was said that before each prayer session, female believers had to perform a purification ritual for him, using their own bodies to wash the man of God. They kissed his dirty feet, believing that this would wash away their sins. People began to associate Rasputin's group with the Klisti, a forbidden sect that believed that the best way to overcome sin was to commit a complete sin, followed by intense repentance. Sin to save. A dangerous and seductive philosophy. Rasputin never admitted to being a Klisti. He was too wise. But he preached a self-made doctrine. His body was sacred. Any woman who slept with him was not committing adultery, but receiving God's grace through his flesh. Intercourse became an act of blessing. It was a brilliant and disgusting idea, justifying his every desire and turning women into fanatic believers. From an illiterate horse thief, Rasputin transformed himself into a prophet. But the Siberian stage had become too small. He heard whispers of St. Petersburg, where the rich and bored aristocrats were yearning for a potent spiritual potion. He knew that was where he belonged. The monster from the Siberian mud was now ready to crawl into the golden palaces. St. Petersburg in the early 20th century was a city of contrasts. Beneath the splendor lay decay. The aristocracy, overcome with boredom and a morbid thirst for spirituality, tried everything: seances, hypnotism, Indian gurus. They were desperately searching for something pure and original. Little did they know, they were preparing a feast for a poisonous snake. Rasputin arrived in St. Petersburg. Imagine the scene: a Siberian peasant, smelling of sweat, garlic, and stables, entering the most refined drawing rooms in Europe. He tore meat with grimy fingers, licked soup spoons clean, and wiped his greasy hands on silk tablecloths. But the aristocracy did not see a boor. They saw genuine, authentic, a living symbol of the Russian soul. He is a strange toy, a dancing bear. But he is not a toy, he is a predator, and he found the perfect prey. Two Montenegrin princess sisters, Militsa and Anastasia, the two black crows of the court because of their passionate love of the occult. They were confidants of the Empress Alexandra Feodorovna. They were immediately captivated by Rasputin and took him into their circle. The doors to the highest sanctuary, the imperial palace, were ajar. The Romanovs were a closed world. Tsar Nicholas II was a weak, incompetent man. The real burden lay on the shoulders of the Empress Alexandra, a German princess who was never loved by the Russian people. She was cold, aloof, and possessed of almost fanatical piety. The greatest burden, the dynasty's most terrifying secret, was their only son, Tsarevich Alexei, who suffered from hemophilia. Any cut could kill him. The entire palace lived in fear. This was the fertile ground Rasputin had been waiting for. On November 1st, 1905, the fateful meeting took place. Rasputin did not use flowery words. He looked straight into the Empress's eyes, not with reverence, but with the understanding of a confessor. To Alexandra, tired of empty rituals, Rasputin was a breath of life. He spoke not to her as an empress, but as a grieving mother. He promised a miracle. The opportunity came in the spring of 1907. Tsarevich Alexei fell and bled internally. The best doctors had given up. In desperation, Alexandra called for Rasputin. The Siberian peasant entered the room filled with the strong smell of medicine. He had no medical equipment with him. He placed his rough hand on the boy's forehead, knelt down, and began to pray, his voice low and steady. He spoke to God like an old friend, commanding the sickness to retreat. And then a miracle happened. The bleeding slowly stopped. The boy lived. For Alexandra, this was a miracle. Rasputin was a living saint. From that moment on, he became our friend, an indispensable part of the family. The snake had entered the Garden of Eden. Rasputin's power did not come from a czarist decree or an official position. It came from a much deeper and more primal source, his absolute control over the mind and emotions of the Empress Alexandra. By becoming Tsarevich Alexei's savior, he became her savior. His every word was divine. His every counsel was taken as wisdom from God. Alexandra, already isolated and distrusted, shut herself off even more from the outside world. She trusted only two people, her husband, whom she saw as a weak martyr, and our friend, whom she saw as the embodiment of divine power. Rasputin became her eyes and ears. He was the prism through which she viewed the entire empire. The peasant's intimacy with the royal family soon caused shock and disgust in the court and St. Petersburg society. Those who had previously seen him as a strange plaything now saw him as a deadly threat. Stories began to leak out, each more gruesome and unbelievable. The princess's governess, Sofia Tyutcheva, was horrified to find Rasputin entering the girls' bedrooms while they were wearing only their nightgowns. He sat on their beds, embraced them, and blessed them. To Rasputin and Alexandra, it was the act of a pure spiritual father. But to anyone with common sense, it was an unacceptable violation. When Tyutcheva complained, she received no sympathy. Instead, Alexandra became angry and fired her on the spot. The message was clear. No one was to doubt our friend. Another governess, who had also initially fallen under Rasputin's spell, came to the royal family in tears, accusing Rasputin of raping her. Alexandra's response was cold and cruel. Everything Grigory did was holy, she said. The woman was also fired. The accusations continued to mount. High society ladies whispered about Rasputin's drunken brags about how he could do whatever he wanted to mother the Empress. He allegedly hosted wild parties in his apartment, where female devotees and prostitutes danced and sang naked. and he boasted obscenely that he cured them with his natural powers, and then the biggest scandal broke. Rasputin, in a drunken and boastful mood, confessed to a monk named Iliador that he had kissed and fondled the empress. Iliador, a fanatic and ambitious man, did not believe him at first. To prove it, Rasputin showed him a stack of letters written in the Empress Alexandra's own hand. The contents of these letters, copied and distributed by Iliador, caused a firestorm. They were not evidence of a physical love affair, but they revealed an emotional and spiritual closeness that bordered on pathos. Alexandra wrote to Rasputin in the tone of a devout believer, a spiritual lover. "I only wish to lay my head on your shoulders," she wrote, "or I kiss your hands and lay my head on your blessed shoulders." To an already suspicious public, these words were tantamount to a confession. Rumors that Rasputin and the Empress were lovers spread throughout Russia, from the tea-houses of Moscow to the trenches of the Eastern Front. Nicholas and Alexandra tried to ignore the accusations. But when it was also alleged that Rasputin had abused a nun, the political pressure became unbearable. Even the most loyal to the regime were disgusted. Rasputin was temporarily forced to leave St. Petersburg and return to Siberia. He became a persona non grata, an unwelcome person. It seemed that the Romanov court had escaped his poisonous influence. But in October 1912, fate intervened once again. While on a hunting trip in Poland, Tsarevich Alexei fell from his horse. The injury did not seem serious, but it caused a huge hematoma in his groin and abdomen. The boy was once again at death's door. The pain was so intense that he kept screaming, "Bury me in the garden! I don't want to die!" The doctors were helpless again. They were preparing for the last rites. In a state of utter panic, Alexandra saw only one way out. Despite everyone's protests, she secretly sent a telegram to Siberia, to the village of Pokrovskoye. She told Rasputin about the situation and begged him to pray. The telegram came soon after. It was short and authoritative. "God has seen your tears and heard your prayers. Do not grieve. The baby will not die. Do not let the doctors bother him too much." And once again, a miracle happened. Immediately after receiving the telegram, Alexei's condition began to improve. The bleeding stopped. The hematoma gradually dissolved. The boy was alive. Historians later proposed a much more mundane theory. At the time, aspirin was a common painkiller and doctors were giving Alexei high doses. But it was not known that aspirin also had anticoagulant effects, which were toxic to hemophiliacs. Rasputin's advice, "Don't let the doctors bother him too much," may have inadvertently stopped the doctors from giving Alexei aspirin, thus saving his life. But for Alexandra, it wasn't science. It was God, working through his people. Her faith in Rasputin was now unshakable. He wasn't just a friend, he was an instrument of God. Anyone who opposed Rasputin was opposing God's will. He returned to St. Petersburg not as an outcast, but as a victor. He seemed invulnerable. He threw himself into his vices with renewed recklessness. He openly preached that any woman who slept with him would be purified, and so his numerous affairs were now approved by God. His power was no longer confined to the royal bedroom. It began to spread to the political arena. In 1914, an event shook Europe and forever changed the fate of Russia. World War I broke out. Tsar Nicholas, a romantic and bound by treaties with the Allies, decided to take Russia into the war. Rasputin, with remarkable lucidity, begged him not to. He is said to have told the Tsar, "If Russia enters the war, it will be the end of the monarchy, of the Romanovs, and of all Russian institutions." It was a chillingly accurate prophecy. But no one listened. Russia went into the war with an initial burst of patriotism, but it quickly turned into a nightmare. Millions of Russian soldiers, ill-equipped peasants, were thrown into the meat grinder of the Eastern Front. The economy collapsed. Inflation soared. Famine began to spread. In 1915, Tsar Nicholas made the most disastrous decision of his life. He decided to go to the front himself to directly command the army. He left the running of the country to Empress Alexandra, and that meant he left Russia in the hands of Rasputin. From there, a madcap drama began. Rasputin, an illiterate peasant, now had direct influence over war decisions, the appointment of ministers, and every aspect of government. A minister was fired for disliking our friend. A general was promoted because his wife was a Rasputin devotee. Important military decisions were made based on his dreams and hunches. Russia, a vast empire, was being run from the Empress's bedroom through the whispers of a lecherous monk. Rasputin's specter no longer haunted just the royal family. It loomed over all of Russia, pushing the empire to the brink of collapse. The corruption had reached its peak. Everyone, from the starving peasants to the Romanov Grand Dukes, realized that this monster had to be destroyed. Otherwise, it would drag them all down to hell. The scythe of death was sharpening. December 1916. St. Petersburg is plunged into the bitter cold of a Russian winter. But the cold outside is nothing compared to the icy hatred seething within the city. To many, Rasputin is no longer a man. He is the embodiment of all the decadence, all the failure, all the disgrace that Russia has endured. He is a demon that must be exorcised to save the soul of the nation. The plot was hatched in sumptuous salons, where cognac was poured and cigars were lit. The conspirators were not proletarian revolutionaries. They were members of the highest echelons of society, men with everything to lose. At the helm was Prince Felix Yusupov, one of the richest men in Russia, husband of the Tsar's niece. He was a transvestite, a cross-dresser, a quintessential product of aristocratic decadence. He was accompanied by Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, the Tsar's cousin, and Vladimir Purishkevich, a far-right politician in the State Duma. They were not professional killers. They were amateurs, motivated by patriotism, personal disgust, and perhaps a tinge of jealousy of Rasputin's power. Their plan was both needlessly complex and shockingly sloppy. Yusupov would lure Rasputin to his Moika palace under the pretext of meeting his beautiful wife Irina, whom Rasputin had long coveted. On the fateful night of December 29th, Yusupov prepared a trap. In a cozy basement, he set a banquet table. On the table were cakes covered in pink cream and bottles of fine Madeira wine. But inside the cakes and wine was a large amount of potassium cyanide, enough to kill an elephant. Other conspirators hid upstairs, waiting for the signal. Rasputin arrived. He had received a death threat that morning, but he seemed unconcerned. He entered the Moika palace, shaking the snow from his beard. Yusupov led him down to the cellar. The tension in the air was so intense it could have been severe. Yusupov, trembling with fear, offered Rasputin cake and wine, and then the unthinkable happened. Rasputin, who supposedly disliked sweets, ate cake after cake. He praised the cakes for their deliciousness. Then he drank wine, also poisoned. He drank glass after glass. Yusupov stared at him, waiting for him to convulse, foam at the mouth, and collapse. But nothing happened. Rasputin sat there, his eyes shining, talking about God and politics. He even complained that his throat was dry and asked for more wine. Horror gripped Yusupov. Who was this man? He was no mortal. He was a demon. Panicked, Yusupov made an excuse to leave the room and ran upstairs to his conspirators. He told them it's unbelievable. He ate all the poison. He's still alive. Plan A failed miserably. They moved on to Plan B. Dmitry handed Yusupov a Browning pistol. Yusupov, mustering up his courage, returned to the bunker. He tried to appear calm, talking to Rasputin about a silver cross with precious stones. When Rasputin turned to look at the cross, Yusupov pulled out a pistol, aimed it at his chest, and pulled the trigger. The sound of a shot echoed through the cellar. Rasputin roared like a wounded animal and fell to the bearskin rug. Yusupov and the other conspirators ran down. They saw the lifeless body, blood smeared on the cloak. They believed that everything was over, but they were wrong. While they were discussing what to do with the body, Yusupov, for some reason, bent down to look at Rasputin again. And then his worst nightmare came true. Rasputin's left eye slowly opened. Then his right. The crazy gray-green eyes stared straight at Yusupov. With a savage growl, the still-living demon sprang to his feet, grabbing Yusupov's neck with both hands. Yusupov broke free and ran up the stairs, his screams echoing throughout the palace. Rasputin, with a bullet in his chest, staggered after him. He crawled on all fours up the stairs, bleeding, screaming, "Felix! Felix!" He escaped into the courtyard, crawling through the snow, shouting that he would report everything to the Empress. At this point, Purishkevich, the politician, regained his composure. He drew his pistol and gave chase. He fired 2 shots but missed. The third hit Rasputin in the back. The fourth, a fatal shot, went straight through his head. Finally, the beast collapsed in a snowdrift. Its body twitched one last time, and then it was still. To be sure, the killers smashed his head with an iron rod. Then they tied the body, wrapped it in a cloth, carried it to the Petrovsky Bridge, and threw it into an ice hole in the frozen Neva River. They believed that the demon was finally destroyed, and his body would never be found. But even in death, Rasputin continued to cause trouble. 2 days later, his body was found, trapped under ice. An autopsy was performed immediately. The report by the surgeon, Dmitry Kosorotov, spawned more legends than it solved. He found 3 gunshot wounds, including one to the forehead. There were several other injuries, possibly from post-mortem beatings. But 2 details were striking. There was no water in Rasputin's lungs, indicating he was dead before being thrown into the river. And, more importantly, no trace of cyanide was found in his stomach. The mystery of the poisoned cakes has haunted historians for decades. Did Rasputin's supernatural powers neutralize the poison? Or did Yusupov lie to make his story more dramatic? Years later, Rasputin's own daughter, Maria, offered a surprisingly simple explanation. She said her father had a stomachache and avoided sweets. Perhaps he hadn't eaten the cakes at all. Or perhaps the cyanide had been neutralized by the sugar in the cakes, or turned into a harmless gas in the cold of the cellar. The truth, as always, was probably more mundane than the legend. Rasputin's death did not save Russia. On the contrary, it was like pulling the last straw. His prophecy came true in a terrifying way. Empress Alexandra fell into a state of complete depression. Tsar Nicholas, deprived of the moral support of our friend, became increasingly confused and indecisive. Just 2 months after Rasputin's death, in February 1917, the revolution broke out. Hungry people and war-weary soldiers took to the streets. This time, there was no one to stop them. That March, Tsar Nicholas II was forced to abdicate. The 300-year-old Romanov dynasty collapsed in a matter of days. A year later, in a cellar in Yekaterinburg, the royal family, Nicholas, Alexandra, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and the fragile baby Alexei, were brutally executed by the Bolsheviks. They died like their spiritual friend in a cold and bloody cellar. Death was not the end of Grigory Rasputin. It was only the beginning of a legend more hideous and enduring than his life. His body, pulled from the icy Neva River, bloated and disfigured by ice, was a silent testimony to a haphazard murder. But to Empress Alexandra, it was the remains of a martyr. She wept bitterly over the stinking corpse, ordering that it be treated with the utmost respect. A secret, almost illegal funeral was held. Attended only by the royal family and a few of their closest friends, they stood shivering in a small chapel as the snow fell outside, burying the demon of Russia as if he were a loved one. Alexandra even placed a cross on the body's chest and signed her name, along with her daughters, on the coffin lid. It was the final act of a mind gone completely astray, a sick devotion to the man who had helped dig the grave of her own family. But Rasputin would not rest in peace. Within weeks, the revolutionary flames he had prophesied would burn, engulfing St. Petersburg and the entire monarchy. The Tsar abdicated. The Romanov family was placed under house arrest, and fear and hatred of Rasputin remained even stronger. Revolutionary soldiers, peasants, and workers were haunted by tales of his dark powers. They believed Rasputin's grave was a source of evil spirits, a pilgrimage site for counter-revolutionaries. They feared that as long as his body remained, the ghost of the old regime would never be banished. In March 1917, a group of soldiers took action. They stormed the chapel, dug up the grave in a frenzy. They pried open the coffin and were confronted with the decomposing body of their enemy. They dragged it out, tossed it onto a truck like a sack of potatoes, and drove it into a remote forest. There, under the bare winter trees, they performed a final exorcism. They built a pyre of wood, doused the body with kerosene, and set it alight. Witnesses later described a grisly scene. As the flames raged, the heat caused the body's muscles and tendons to contract. In a cloud of black smoke and the stench of charred flesh, Rasputin's corpse seemed to slowly rise. The soldiers, drunk and superstitious, screamed in horror. They believed the demon was not dead, that he was trying to rise from hell. They fired wildly at the pyre, blasting what remained of the body until it was nothing more than a pile of ash and bone. They had tried to erase him from the physical world, but in doing so only deepened the legend of a man whom even death could not conquer. And from that ashes, another legend, even more profane and bizarre, was born. It was the legend of Rasputin's penis. People began whispering that in the chaos of the autopsy or cremation, a maid or a fanatic had cut off his genitals and preserved them as a holy relic. This legend was fed by Rasputin's own reputation in life. A tireless predator, a superhuman sex power who had conquered hundreds of women, from maids to noblewomen, and perhaps even the empress. His penis became a symbol of all he stood for: raw power, wild fertility, the violation of a man rudely entered the elite, decadent room of the aristocracy. For decades, the so-called Rasputin penis has had a strange journey. It was said to have been worshipped by a group of Russian women in exile in Paris. Then it turned up in America, briefly owned by Rasputin's daughter, Maria, before she sold it in a time of need. Eventually, a supposed relic, a nearly foot-long piece of cartilage, dried and gray, preserved in a glass jar, found its way to an erotic museum in St. Petersburg. Whether real or fake, its existence and the public's fascination with it speaks for itself. Rasputin cannot be separated from his raw sexual power. Even in dust, the legend of his virility endures, a profane and immortal legacy. But Rasputin left behind more than just gruesome legends. He also left behind a flesh-and-blood family who suffered the consequences of his life and death. His wife, Praskovia, and his son, Dmitri, remained in Siberia. When the Russian Civil War broke out and the Red Army swept through their land, both disappeared. No one knows exactly what happened to them. They were most likely murdered by the Bolsheviks, who considered anyone with the name Rasputin an enemy of the people. They died anonymously, crushed under the wheels of history their husband and father had helped set in motion. One of his children, however, survived to tell the tale. Matryona, who later took the name Maria, proved to be as tenacious as her father. She fled revolutionary Russia, embarking on an unlikely life of wandering. She became a cabaret dancer in Paris, exploiting her infamous name to draw in curious audiences. She then emigrated to America, where she joined a circus and became a lion tamer. Imagine that, the daughter of the mad monk controlling wild animals to the applause of the crowd. Her life was a series of odd jobs: a munitions factory worker during World War II, a nurse, a nanny. She wrote books about her father, trying to both defend him and cash in on his legacy. She lived a long life, dying in poverty in California in 1977. Maria was a living legacy of Rasputin, a survivor, an opportunist, forever haunted by the enormous shadow of the father she both loved and hated. Ultimately, Rasputin's most powerful legacy may be his prophecies. Before his death, he is said to have written a letter to the Tsar, which included a chilling passage. "If I am killed by your brothers, the Russian nobles, then none of your family, not one of your children or relatives, will survive more than 2 years. They will be killed by the Russian people. I will be killed. I will no longer be among the living. Pray, pray, be strong." Whether the letter was real or a clever later fabrication, it was terrifyingly accurate. Rasputin was murdered by aristocrats in December 1916. Less than 2 years later, in July 1918, the entire Tsarist family was massacred. The prophecy came true, cementing Rasputin's status as a mystic with the ability to see into the future. But perhaps it wasn't magic. Perhaps it was just the wisdom of a man born from the bottom. Rasputin, unlike the aristocrats who lived in their bubble, understood the deep hatred that seethed in the hearts of the Russian people. He knew that if the elite started killing each other, the entire corrupt structure would collapse, and the rage of the masses would engulf everything. And so the story seemed to end. The body burned, the family scattered, the legend formed. But to truly understand the scar Rasputin left behind, we must look beyond his ashes and the Romanov mass grave. We must look at the world that emerged from that collapse, a world he, in his own oblivious and vile way, helped to birth. Rasputin was not a storm. He was the smell that preceded the storm. He did not create the rot of the Romanov dynasty. He was attracted to it. He was a mold that thrives only in damp, dim, stagnant environments. To understand him, one must first understand the darkness into which he descended. It was a world of utter emptiness. A czar, Nicholas II, who should have been the embodiment of absolute power, was a small, frail man, a good father, but an incompetent king, more interested in jotting down trifles in his diary than in ruling 1/6 of the earth. He was a power vacuum, and beside him stood Empress Alexandra, a void even deeper and more dangerous. She was a spiritual void, a German hated in Russia, a pathologically fanatical Orthodox Christian, a mother tormented by guilt for passing on a hereditary curse to her only son. Her piety was not faith, it was a lingering panic. She was not looking for God. She was looking for reassurance, a sedative, an authoritative voice that could drown out the constant screaming in her head. The court priests, with their elaborate rituals and empty prayers, could not reach that primal pain. They were pale shadows. And into that double void, a weak authority and a hysterical faith, Rasputin stepped. He did not bring complicated doctrine. He brought certainty. He was a rough peasant, but he never doubted himself. His voice did not beg, it commanded. His eyes did not see, they invaded. For Alexandra, who lived in constant fear and uncertainty, Rasputin's absolute confidence was more than a comfort. It was a drug. He did not say, "Let's pray to God for help." He said, "The child will not die." He did not comfort her. He gave her a command to believe. Theirs was more than a simple relationship between a believer and a prophet. It was deeper and more morbid. It was a psychological symbiosis. Rasputin became the anchor for Alexandra's madness. By curing Alexei, he did more than save a child. He cleansed the mother of her sins. He told her that Alexei's illness was not her fault, but a test from God, and that he, Rasputin, was God's answer. He freed her from the greatest psychological burden of her life. In return, she gave him everything, her trust, her protection, and through her, power over an empire. He became her spiritual father, her confessor, and perhaps, in some dark corner of her mind, the embodiment of a primal male power that her frail husband could never possess. And what about the aristocracy? Why did they open their arms to this filthy Siberian bear in the first place? Because they too were a void, a cultural void. They had lost touch with their own country. They spoke French in their drawing rooms, imitated Parisian fashions, and looked upon the Russian peasants as a different species, both contemptible and worthy of romanticization. For them, Rasputin was a toy, a liaki, hunting for strange things. He was truth in a package. His stench was the smell of the motherland. His vulgar stories were the voice of the true Russian soul. They fetishized his vulgarity. They invited him to parties to watch him eat like a pig, to hear him utter obscure prophecies, to feel a little thrill, a primitive thrill in their dull and boring lives. They played with a creature they did not understand. They opened a cage to let a wild animal into their home just for fun, not realizing that the animal would soon tear them apart. And what about Rasputin himself? Was he a fully conscious con man, a master manipulator from start to finish? Or did he truly believe in his own power? The truth may lie somewhere more sinister. It is possible that he began as an opportunist, a healer, a village charlatan with a natural talent for reading people. But the most powerful magic in the world is the trust of others. When one person, then another, then the Empress of all Russia, looks into your eyes and believes you are a saint, you begin to believe it. When Alexei first recovered, perhaps no one was more surprised than Rasputin himself. He had rolled the psychic die and it had hit, but for him it was proof. His power was real. He had entered a dangerous feedback loop. Their belief reinforced his, and his belief reinforced theirs. He had become a con man who believed his own lies. This explains his monstrous duplicity, a man who could offer astonishingly lucid political advice in the morning, then indulge in a drunken orgy with prostitutes in the evening. In his mind, the two were not contradictory. Because he was a man of God, he was above human law. His sins were not sins. They were simply a way for him to become closer to the profanity of humanity, so that he could repent more vigorously later. He is a monster drunk with his own legend. Ultimately, the murder at the Moika Palace was not a political act. It was an exorcism. Felix Yusupov and his co-conspirators were not just killing a man. They were trying to kill an idea, a symbol of their own powerlessness and shame. Rasputin was a mirror of their own depravity, and they were trying to shatter that mirror. Their recklessness, poison, then gun, then club, then drowning, revealed an almost superstitious fear. They were not fighting a political opponent. They felt they were fighting Satan himself, because Rasputin had somehow become the embodiment of all that was irrational, chaotic, and dark that was seething just beneath the surface of their orderly world. He had to die, not because he held any real power, but because his very existence was an affront. The presence of a filthy, lecherous peasant in the royal bedchamber was the final, irrefutable proof that the entire system was a farce, an empty sham about to collapse. He was a pustule on a body already septic, and the murderers, in their panic, tried to squeeze the pustule out, not realizing that the disease had spread to the marrow. Rasputin is not the final chapter in the story of the Russian Empire. He is the bloody preface to an entirely new and much more terrible book, the 20th century. He is the last spasm of an old world, a world of divinely appointed kings, bearded prophets, hereditary curses, and bedroom miracles. He embodied an ancient, irrational kind of power based on superstition and charisma, and his chaotic death, followed by the collapse of the entire order he had parasitized, paved the way for a new kind of power. A modern kind, cold, unfeeling, and systematic. The power of ideology. Think about it. The horror that Rasputin wrought was personal. He corrupted a family. He slept with women. He whispered bad advice into the Empress's ear, got several ministers fired and several incompetent men appointed. He was a cancer, but a localized one. The horror that followed him, the horror of Bolshevism, was something else entirely. It was not personal. It was abstract. It did not kill out of hatred or lust. It killed for a scheme, a theory. It did not seek to seduce individuals. It sought to reform entire social classes and was prepared to exterminate millions as a necessary surgical procedure. Rasputin was the last of the old demons. He was a demon you could identify, a face, a beard, a pair of eyes. The demons of the 20th century were nameless. They were committees, graphiocratias machines, death sentences stamped en masse. Rasputin, for all his lechery and crudeness, was still a man. Stalin, the heir to the chaos Rasputin left behind, was a machine. That machine, in its ruthless efficiency, inflicted suffering on a scale the lecherous monk from Siberia could never have imagined. In a way, Rasputin was the reason the revolution that followed was so brutal. He discredited not just the monarchy, but the very concept of faith and mysticism. He turned the Russian soul, which the intelligentsia had romanticized, into a vulgar farce. He showed how faith could be twisted into a tool for manipulation and the gratification of the basest desires. The Bolsheviks' response to this was one of radical denial. They wanted to destroy all traces of mysticism, of religion, of anything that could not be measured and explained by scientific materialism. They didn't just kill the Tsar and his family. They tried to kill God. They wanted to replace the cross with the hammer and sickle, replace the Bible with the Communist Manifesto. The war against Rasputin and his legacy became a war against the irrational soul of Russia itself. And that was the final tragedy. Russia, in its attempt to remove a superstitious tumor, had cut out a piece of its own soul and replaced it with one even colder and deader. Rasputin fever was cured by the shock therapy of the Gulag. The chaos of a manipulated court was replaced by the iron order of a totalitarian state. So what are we left with? We are left with a parable, a warning that never grows old. Rasputin himself is unimportant. He is nothing. What matters is the void he filled. He teaches us that when established institutions, whether churches, governments, or elites, become alienated, corrupt, and discredited by the people, a dangerous vacuum arises. And nature abhors a vacuum. Something always rises to fill it. It may take the form of a bright-eyed prophet, a politician promising to drain the swamp, an ideologue with a perfect theory that explains everything. But its essence is always the same. It promises certainty in an uncertain age. It offers simple answers to complex problems. It tells frightened people exactly what they want to hear. It does not demand critical thinking. It demands obedience. Rasputin was a crude, pre-modern version of this phenomenon, but the mechanism remains the same. He is eternal proof that civilization is but a thin layer of ice, and just beneath it flows an underground stream of fear, superstition, and fanaticism. If there is a big enough crack in that ice, the water will gush forth, and the monsters from the depths will rise to the surface. So don't ever think of his story as a strange side note to history. He is not a thing of the past. He is an ever-present possibility. He is a reminder that no society, no matter how advanced, is immune to the virus he carries. He is a ghost in the machine, an irrational whisper in a world that tries to be logical. And he will always be there waiting for a weak king, a frightened queen, and a people who have lost faith in everything.